Ayira Mensah never expected a single wrong turn to rewrite her destiny or place her under the protection of the most dangerous man in Seoul. In a private airport lounge thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and impending death, she stumbled upon what the world was never meant to see. Kang Do-seok, the unbothered king of the underworld, standing amidst the chaos of a failed assassination. While the city's elite trembled at his name, Ayira stood frozen, her white satin dress a stark, blood-chilling contrast against the dark suits and drawn weapons of the Kang Syndicate. She was a witness, a ghost in the room, a liability that should have been erased before her next breath. But as Do-seok's gaze, composed, territorial, and heavy with a silent command, locked on her wide, terrified eyes, the air in the room shifted. He didn't signal his men to eliminate her. Instead, he moved with a predator's grace, his large hand clamping firmly around her arm, pulling her into his space in a gesture of absolute ownership. He didn't know she was just a student running late for an interview. He didn't know she was clutching a scholarship essay in her trembling hand. He only knew that to save her, he had to claim her. "Lower your weapons," his voice echoed, silencing the room. "You're looking at the future, Mrs. Kang." In that moment, the ballroom of the underworld froze. Ayira didn't know she was breaking a blood code that had stood for generations. She didn't know that by leaning into his touch for safety, she had just become the only piece on the board Do-seok wasn't willing to lose. Something inside the cold, immovable boss snapped, and his entire empire suddenly aligned around a woman who was never supposed to be there. 3 weeks before the cold elegance of the VIP lounge would become her sanctuary and her cage, Ayira Mensah stood in the center of her Seoul dormitory, surrounded by the ghosts of her ambition. The room was stripped bare. Her textbooks had been sold to a junior student for a fraction of their worth, and the colorful Kent cloth her mother had sent from Accra was folded neatly atop her suitcase, a final piece of home in a city that was preparing to spit her out. The scholarship office had been unyielding. A clerical error back home meant her funding had vanished, leaving her with a mountain of tuition debt and a student visa that was expiring in 72 hours. To the university, she was just a statistic. To the immigration office, she was a liability. But to herself, she was a failure. She had spent nights scrubbing floors in closed-off cafes and days mastering the intricacies of Korean diplomacy, only to find herself staring at an eviction notice that felt like a death warrant. The interview for the International Cultural Liaison position was her final, desperate gamble. It had appeared on a private job board, promising a salary that seemed like a hallucination. As she dressed in her one remaining luxury, the white satin dress she had intended for her graduation, Ayira tried to ignore the tremor in her hands. The dress was a symbol of the future she was losing, its silk cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the humid, suffocating heat of her radiator-less room. She arrived at the airport district breathless, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm against the polished floor. The directions she had been whispered were vague, pointing toward a private executive wing near the international terminal. As she hurried through the corridors, her mind was a whirlwind of practiced phrases and desperate prayers. She didn't notice the lack of signage or the way the usual airport bustle had faded into an eerie, heavy silence. She saw a set of heavy, double-oak doors at the end of a corridor, unmarked, imposing, and guarded by the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. Thinking she was late for the board of directors, Ayira smoothed her dress, took a stabilizing breath, and pushed her way inside. She didn't find a panel of interviewers. She found a room thick with the scent of ozone and expensive tobacco, and a man with a neck tattoo whose eyes promised a very different kind of future. She had been looking for a job to pay her debts, but as the heavy doors clicked shut behind her, Ayira Mensah realized she had just traded her financial ruin for a far more dangerous kind of debt. The black sedan moved through the heart of Seoul like a silent predator, its windows dark enough to turn the vibrant neon city into a blurred, distant memory. Inside, Ayira clutched her worn leather bag against her white satin dress, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm that felt entirely too loud in the plush, leather-scented interior. Beside her, Kang Do-seok sat in effortless silence, his broad shoulders reclaiming the space, his unbothered stare fixed on the flickering lights outside. He hadn't spoken since the airport, but his hand had remained firmly on her upper arm until the doors locked, a physical reminder that she had been claimed. The Kang estate was a fortress of limestone and glass perched high above the Han River, hidden behind gates that hummed with a quiet, lethal electricity. As they stepped into the grand foyer, the air felt different, thinner, heavier, polished to a cold, high sheen. Ayira looked up at the vaulted ceilings and the winding marble staircases, but all she saw were the cameras tucked into every corner and the men in tailored black suits standing at every exit. "You will stay here," Do-seok said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to command the very walls. He didn't ask, he stated a fact. He led her into a library lined with dark wood and shadows, where a single document waited on a desk of solid obsidian. It wasn't a job offer or a scholarship extension. It was a marriage contract, thick with legal jargon and the weight of a bloodbound vow. "My grandfather's dying wish was for me to marry," Do-seok explained, stepping into her personal space until the scent of his expensive tobacco and wood smoke clouded her senses. "My enemies believe you are the woman I chose in secret. If you leave, you are a witness they must eliminate. If you sign, you are the future Mrs. Kang, and you are untouchable." Ayira looked at the pen, then at the man whose neck tattoo peeked from beneath his collar like a coiled serpent. "And the price?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Everything," he replied, his gaze dropping to her lips. "Your name, your schedule, your solitude. You will live under my roof, eat at my table, and answer only to me. In this house, there are no secrets I do not own." She realized then that the gilded cage wasn't just a metaphor. By signing that paper to escape the ghosts of Chicago and the assassins of Seoul, she was surrendering her very identity. She was no longer Ayira Mensah, the struggling student. She was a piece on a grander board, a bird trapped in a palace of glass where the windows never opened and the king never looked away. With a shaking hand, she pressed the pen to the paper, the ink sealing of fate that was as luxurious as it was lethal. The silence of the Kang estate was not the absence of sound, but the presence of 1,000 unsaid threats. Ayira stood in the center of the grand drawing room, her reflection caught in the towering floor-to-ceiling mirrors that made the space feel like an infinite, silver-lined trap. She still felt like the student from Chicago, hiding the fraying edges of her confidence behind a borrowed white satin dress. But Do-seok was determined to strip that girl away. "In this world, Ayira, your hesitation is a target," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that seemed to vibrate through the marble floor. He stood behind her, not touching her, yet his shadow engulfed her reflection. "You walk like someone who is afraid to take up space. From this moment, you do not ask for permission to exist. You own the ground beneath your feet." He moved to her side, his movements a masterclass in controlled power. "Rule 1, the eyes. Never look down. To look down is to acknowledge a superior, and in this room, you have none but me." He reached out, his thumb catching her chin and tilting it upward until her gaze was locked onto his. His stare was unbothered, territorial, and heavy with the weight of a kingpin who had never known the word no. "Rule 2, the voice," he continued, his hand dropping to rest firmly on the small of her back, guiding her forward. "You speak as if every word is a decree. Do not explain yourself. Explanations are for those who fear being misunderstood. You are the woman of the Kang Syndicate. Your silence is more powerful than their shouting." They walked the length of the hall, a rhythmic, synchronized pace that he forced her to maintain. He taught her how to sit, back straight, hands composed, a picture of delicate resilience that masked a lethal association. He taught her the hierarchy of the men who bowed as they passed, which ones to acknowledge with a sharp nod and which ones to ignore entirely. "You are not just a bride," he whispered, leaning close enough that the scent of sandalwood and danger clouded her mind. "You are a symbol. My enemies will look at you to find a crack in my armor. If you look afraid, they will strike. If you look soft, they will bite." As the moon rose over the Han River, casting long, jagged shadows through the glass walls, Ayira felt the transformation taking hold. The first lesson wasn't just about etiquette, it was about survival. Under Do-seok's relentless, quiet dominance, the struggling student was being buried, and a queen of the shadows was beginning to rise. She looked at their joined reflection in the glass, the tall, broad-shouldered kingpin and the striking, dark-skinned woman at his side, and realized that the girl who had entered the wrong door was gone forever. Under his tutelage, she was learning the most dangerous lesson of all: how to be a woman worth dying for. The Grand Hyatt Ballroom was a cathedral of glass and light, filled with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of hidden power. Ayira stepped into the space with her hand resting lightly on Do-seok's forearm, her fingers brushing the fine wool of his tailored tuxedo. She felt the weight of 1,000 stares, some curious, some hungry, all dangerous. She was no longer the student in the frayed dormitory. She was a vision in midnight silk, her skin glowing like polished obsidian under the chandeliers. But beneath the elegance, her pulse was a frantic staccato. "Breathe, Ayira," Do-seok whispered, his voice a low vibration meant only for her. He didn't look at her. His unbothered gaze swept the room, marking every exit and every enemy. "You are the center of this room. Act like it." The test came sooner than expected. During the first toast, they were approached by Chairman Park, a man whose smile was as sharp and cold as a razor blade. He was the strategist of the rival clans, a man who dealt in the currency of secrets. He bowed deeply, but his eyes remained on Ayira, searching for the crack in her foundation. "A stunning choice, Kang Do-seok," Park remarked, his voice smooth and oily. "We were all quite surprised. We had heard you were unreachable. To find you've been hiding a fiancé for 3 years is a masterpiece of discretion." He turned his predator's focus to Ayira. "Tell me, Miss Mensah, how did you handle the tragedy of the Busan port in his early days? Most women would have fled when the ships burned, yet you stayed. It must have been a very bonding experience for you both." The air in the circle grew thin. Ayira felt the trap snap shut. She knew nothing of a burning port in Busan. It was a ghost from a past she hadn't lived. She felt Do-seok's arms stiffen beneath her hand, his posture turning territorial. If she hesitated, the lie would shatter, and their lives would be the forfeit. Ayira didn't look at Do-seok. She looked directly into Park's flinty eyes, her chin tilting upward just as Do-seok had taught her. She let a small, enigmatic smile touch her lips, a smile that promised she knew more than she would ever say. "The fire was bright, Chairman Park," she said, her voice steady and echoing with a quiet authority that silenced the nearby whispers. "But when you're standing beside a man like Do-seok, you don't look at the flames. You look at what comes after. Some things are forged in heat, not broken by it. Don't you agree?" Park's smile faltered, his gaze flickering to Do-seok, who was now looking at Ayira with an intensity that bordered on reverence. The rival boss bowed again, lower this time, acknowledging a defeat he hadn't expected. As he moved away, Do-seok leaned in, his hand sliding to the small of Ayira's back, pulling her flush against him. "Well played," he rasped, his eyes dark with a new, dangerous admiration. "You didn't just survive the test, Ayira. You became the storm." The luxury of the Kang estate was a veneer that Ayira finally began to peel back during a restless night when the walls felt too thick and the silence too loud. She had wandered into Do-seok's private study, a room usually guarded by his physical presence, but now left ajar in the wake of an emergency meeting. The air inside smelled of old vellum and a sharper, metallic scent she couldn't quite name. On the obsidian desk lay a leather-bound book, its pages filled with a cramped, elegant script that contrasted with the man's brutal reputation. It wasn't a ledger of debts or a list of enemies. It was a record of loss. Ayira's breath hitched as she read the entries. Dates of funerals, the names of men he had tried to save from the syndicate's grip, and the recurring, haunting phrase, "How many more until the debt is paid?" She was so absorbed in the words that she didn't hear the door click shut. Curiosity could be a terminal illness in this house, Ayira Do-seok said. He was standing by the window, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his white shirt unbuttoned to the waist. The moonlight hit him at a sharp angle, revealing what the shadows usually hid. Ayira looked up, but her eyes didn't stop at his face. They traced the ink that crawled across his chest and shoulders. Not just the phoenix on his neck, but an intricate, sprawling map of scars and symbols. These weren't just tattoos, they were a tally. Every mark represented a piece of his soul, traded to keep the syndicate from collapsing into total anarchy. She saw the dates she had just read in the journal etched into his skin, a permanent weight he carried under his expensive suits. "You aren't the king of this empire," she whispered, her voice trembling as she stood. "You're its prisoner." Do-seok stepped into the light, his unbothered stare finally cracking to reveal a deep, weary hollow. He didn't move to hide himself. "My father left a war that has no end. Chairman Yu and the others, they don't want peace. They want the blood I was born to represent. If I walk away, the streets burn. If I stay, I burn." Ayira reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the ink on his ribs. For the first time, she didn't see the feared kingpin who had claimed her in a VIP lounge. She saw a man forced into a lethal masquerade, waiting for someone to see the person behind the ink. "You're fighting to end it," she said, her realization echoing in the quiet room. Do-seok caught her hand, his grip territorial yet desperate, pressing her palm against the steady, heavy thrum of his heart. "I was fighting to survive it," he rasped, his eyes locking onto hers with a raw intensity. "But now, I am fighting to make sure you aren't the last thing I lose." In the intimacy of the study, the fake bride realized her husband was a man drowning in a sea of blood and ink, and for the first time, she didn't want to run from the storm. She wanted to help him end it. The walls of the Kang estate, once a sanctuary of marble and glass, suddenly felt as thin as paper when the flashing lights of government vehicles crested the driveway. The betrayal had come from within the shadows of the city's bureaucracy. A rival clan, unable to break Do-seok's physical defenses, had opted to weaponize the law. Someone had leaked Ayira's original, unfinished scholarship records to the immigration services, flagging her presence in the country as a high-priority violation. Ayira stood in the center of the grand foyer, her face a mask of delicate resilience that cracked as the officials entered. The lead agent held a deportation order that felt like a death sentence. Not because she feared her home in Ghana, but because she knew that once she stepped past the airport gates, she would be a defenseless target for Chairman Yu's assassins. The visa was granted under false pretenses, the agent stated, his voice a flat, bureaucratic drone. "Unless there is a legitimate, binding reason for your stay, Miss Mensah will be taken into custody for immediate removal." The air in the room grew cold as Do-seok stepped forward. He didn't look at the agents. His gaze was fixed on Ayira, territorial and absolute. He saw the flicker of this self-reliance complex in her eyes, the urge to walk away and save him the trouble, and he moved to crush it. "There is a reason," Do-seok interrupted, his voice a low, melodic vibration that commanded the room. He reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box, but he didn't hand it to her. He stepped into her space, his large hand sliding to the nape of her neck, tilting her head back until she was forced to see the raw, unbothered intensity in his eyes. He didn't care about the agents watching. He didn't care about the cameras. He knelt before her, not as a kingpin performing for an audience, but as a man who had realized that he could no longer live in a world where she didn't exist. He slid a diamond the size of a teardrop on her finger, a ring that carried the weight of the entire Kang legacy. "We aren't waiting for a gala," he rasped, his thumb stroking her cheek as he stood. "The marriage license was filed this morning. She is no longer a student guest. She is my wife, my blood, my life." The officials hesitated, the weight of the Kang name and the undeniable, burning reality of the connection before them forcing their hands. As they retreated to verify the sudden, binding change in status, Do-seok didn't let her go. He pulled her flush against his chest, his heart hammering a frantic, heavy rhythm against her own. The trap had intended to separate them, but in his desperation to save her, the fake connection had shattered. As he held her in the silent foyer, Ayira realized the price of her safety was no longer a contract. It was the terrifying reality of a man who would rewrite the laws of a nation just to keep her by his side. The sanctuary of a new marriage license had barely cooled when Chairman Yu's desperation reached its lethal peak. Ayira had been intercepted during a supply run for Tai Jun's music therapy, the syndicate's armored car forced off the road by a coordinated strike. She woke not in a palace, but in the skeletal remains of an abandoned grain silo on the edge of the city. Her hands were bound, but her mind, the sharp, analytical mind of a woman who had survived the foster systems of Chicago, remained terrifyingly clear. Through the rusted gaps in the walls, she saw the trap being laid. Yu's men were positioning snipers at every vantage point, eyes fixed on the horizon for Do-seok's inevitable, high-speed arrival. They expected a frantic husband. They expected a man who would trade his tactical advantage for the woman he loved. Ayira didn't wait to be a trophy for the rescue. Using the edge of a discarded metal shim on the floor, she began to saw at her restraints, her dark skin glistening with sweat and effort. As the zip ties snapped, she didn't run for the exit. Instead, she moved through the shadows of the upper catwalks. She had spent weeks studying Do-seok's security blueprints, learning how he coordinated his strikes through localized frequencies. Finding the main breaker box near the loading dock, Ayira didn't cut the power, she surged it. Using her knowledge of the building's old wiring, she created a rhythmic, sparking short circuit that mimicked the distress codes Do-seok's men used. It was a beacon in the dark, a signal that told his approaching team exactly where the snipers were nested. When the first door exploded inward, Ayira didn't cower. She grabbed a heavy iron pipe, her white satin dress now streaked with grease and oil, and jammed it into the gears of the heavy cargo lift, trapping the lead assassin between floors. Do-seok burst into the room, his weapon raised, his eyes wild with a territorial ferocity. He expected to find a victim. Instead, he found Ayira standing over a neutralized guard, the breaker box behind her sparking in a controlled cadence. "The snipers are on the north ridge," she shouted over the roar of gunfire, her voice echoing with the authority he had taught her. "I've jammed the communication hub. They're blind." Do-seok's men moved with surgical precision, capitalizing on the chaos she had created. He reached her in a single, desperate stride, his hand catching her nape and pulling her into the hard, protective line of his body. He smelled of gunpowder and absolute relief. "I told you to wait for me," he rasped, his forehead leaning against hers, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "I'm not a trophy, Do-seok," she whispered, her fingers curling into his lapel. "I'm your partner." In the ruins of the warehouse, as the smoke cleared and the rival faction lay broken, the unbothered king looked at his wife and realized she wasn't just someone to protect. She was the strategist of his heart, the woman who had turned a trap into a triumph. The transition from victory to crisis happened in the pulse between two heartbeats. As they stepped away from the smoking ruins of the warehouse, a final, desperate shot echoed from the tree line. Do-seok didn't flinch. He simply grunted, his body jolting as he stepped in front of Ayira, a human shield by instinct. It wasn't until they were back inside the armored sedan that the scent of iron filled the air. His white shirt was blossoming with a deep, liquid crimson, and the hand that usually held her with such territorial strength began to tremble. By the time they reached the estate's private medical wing, the syndicate was in a state of frantic, leaderless vibration. Do-seok was rushed into surgery, leaving Ayira standing in the foyer, her hands stained with the blood of the man who had rewritten her life. The silence that followed was the most dangerous kind, the silence of a vacuum waiting to be filled by predators. The estate's chief of security, a man named Han who had seen 3 generations of Kong blood, stood before her with a satellite phone and a look of grim resignation. "The board is calling for a vote of succession," Han said, his voice low. "Chairman Yu is already claiming Do-seok is dead. The ports are stalled, and the investors are fleeing. We have a flight prepared for you, Ayira. Chicago, Accra, anywhere. You have 10 minutes to disappear before the gates are breached." Ayira looked at the plane ticket in Han's hand. It was the scholar's debt, paid in full. An escape back to the life where her only worry was a visa or a landlord. She could go back to being a ghost in Chicago, a woman who had seen too much but lived to tell the tale. She turned her gaze to the heavy oak doors where Do-seok lay fighting for his life. She thought of the journals, the tattoos, and the man who had surrendered his soul to a war he never wanted. If she left, the syndicate would descend into a bloodbath that would consume everything he had tried to protect, including Taijun. The self-reliance complex that had once defined her flickered and died, replaced by a cold, territorial fire. She didn't take the ticket. Instead, she took the satellite phone. "Tell the board members to meet in the Grand Hall in 20 minutes, Ayira said, her voice dropping into the low, melodic authority Do-seok had taught her. She smoothed the blood-stained silk of her dress, her chin tilting upward until her gaze was as unbothered as a winter sky. "What are you doing?" Han asked, his eyes widening. "I am not a guest in this house, and I am not a witness to its fall," she replied, her heels clicking a lethal, rhythmic beat against the marble as she walked toward the head of the table. "I am the woman of the Kong Syndicate, and while my husband sleeps, I am the king." As she stepped into the light of the meeting room, Ayira realized she was no longer choosing between 2 lives. She was choosing to be the storm that would keep the world at bay until the man she loved could wake to find his empire still standing. The transition from the blood-stained warehouse to the glass-walled boardrooms of the new Kong Global was not a quiet evolution, but a surgical restructuring. For months, while Do-seok recovered under the watchful, territorial eye of his wife, Ayira had sat at the head of the obsidian desk. She didn't lead with bullets. She led with the same rhythmic, analytical precision that had once defined her studies. She dismantled the black market ties, laundered the syndicate's reputation through transparency, and pivoted the empire's vast logistics network into a legitimate tech and shipping conglomerate that spanned the Han River to the Atlantic. The fake label that had haunted their union evaporated in the heat of their shared survival. There were no more marriage contracts signed in shadows. There was only the undeniable reality of 2 people who had looked into the abyss and decided to build a bridge across it. The neck tattoo that had once signaled a lethal warning was now framed by the collar of a philanthropist's suit, though the unbothered intensity in Do-seok's eyes remained, now reserved solely for the woman who had saved his legacy. The day of the graduation ceremony at Seoul National University was a bright, crisp afternoon that felt like a final exhale. The auditorium was a sea of black robes and mortarboards, filled with the hum of families and the scent of hope. Ayira stood behind the stage curtain, adjusting the hood of her doctoral gown. She was no longer the girl with the eviction notice or the student whose visa was a ticking bomb. She was a doctor of international relations, a woman who had navigated the most dangerous diplomacy on earth. When her name was called, the applause was polite and steady, but the air in the room shifted as she stepped toward the podium. In the very center of the front row sat a man who didn't belong in a room of academics, yet commanded it entirely. Kang Do-seok sat with his hands folded, his broad shoulders filling the space, his gaze locked onto Ayira with a pride so fierce it felt physical. Beside him, Tae-jun sat tall, clutching a bouquet of lilies, his eyes bright with a voice that was no longer silent. Ayira accepted her diploma, the paper a symbol of the debt she had finally paid to herself. She looked down at the man who had once claimed her in a VIP lounge, and for the first time, she saw no shadows, only the light of a new dynasty they had forged together. As she turned to face the crowd, her chin tilted upward, a queen of her own making. The scholar's debt was cleared, the Mafia king was redeemed, and as she met Do-seok's smile, she knew the music of their life was no longer a frantic staccato, but a deep, eternal cadence of peace. Thank you for watching. If you love the story, hit that like button, leave a comment with your favorite parts, and subscribe to Mafia Secret Love Stories so you don't miss out on our next story.